low and take a better average. But here, because there are only 4 teams competing, we just have 3 judges.
Elizabeth Holmes up next, another BYU Cougar, freshman from South Jordan, Utah. 203B for Holmes.
Beautiful dive in the air. I do like her position. I think a tighter pike would be important on this dive. Again, the judges are going to get very nitpicky, so you really need to make sure when you're in the pike position that everything is absolutely perfect. Those legs are perfectly straight and your chest is on your knees, essentially.
3 6.5s for Holmes. And you had mentioned it yesterday, Kat, the importance of this meet. These are all 3 boards that will be contested at the Big 12 Championships, moving on to the NCAA Championships as well. Platform happening tomorrow. Unfortunately, we don't get to see that on the air. It's always exciting, but this is a big tune-up for all of these divers.
It is. It will be the first time that they can compete in the platform event. Well, ideally, maybe they had another opportunity early on, depending on the school and where you've decided to go with your schedule. But for the Texas athletes, they have not had the chance to compete in a platform event so far this season. So it really gives you a good idea of what that baseline is, where you are at kind of the halfway point or a little bit earlier in the season, and what you need to work on as you're heading into really important months like February and March.
How about the dive there from the junior from Miami and Carolyn Chaney?
The best dive we've seen so far today. Beautiful pike position in the air. Excellent entry into the water. She's going to be very excited to start her night off with that.
3 7.5s for the junior, hailing from Boca Raton, Florida. Finished 6th place in yesterday's 3-meter. We'll bring up Wally Leyland, the senior from Orlando, Florida. Wally, a 3rd place finish in yesterday's event. Was 3rd at the 2017 USA Diving National Championships in this event.
And wow, that's a heck of a way to start things off. What sets Wally apart is really her entry into the water. I don't know if anyone in this competition can hit the water with such an impressive rip as Wally, and the judges notice that.
Saw her head coach Randy Abelman looking on in his 28th season at the helm. 9-time NCAA Diving Coach of the Year. As you see the scores from Leyland and a couple 8s on the board for the senior. Had a very good opening dive, 61.10 for Wally Leyland. Marcela Maric, we talked about in the open, junior from Zadar, Croatia. Maric, a 2nd place finish in yesterday's 3-meter. We'll start things off with that 403B that you had mentioned. We will see from 4 competitors in this opening round.
This is a heck of a way to start off her evening as well. Other athletes have competed it, and this was the best inward 1.5 that we have seen. Absolutely perfect distance from the diving board, which is very important on an inward dive. So you see here, she's not too close, but she also didn't back away too far. Perfectly vertical when she's hitting the water as well.
The scores, 2 7s and a 7.5. Solid 51.60 for Maric. That will bring up Murphy Bromberg, the redshirt junior from Texas. You mentioned the last 2 seasons she was out due to injury, also prepping for international competition as well, hailing from Bexley, Ohio. She actually changed up her dive order, shifted everything that we thought we were going to see up one, and added in a new dive at the end. So interested to see how she dives coming off yesterday, where she finished 4th.
Absolutely, and I love what she's doing. She did the same thing in the 3-meter event, where in the finals, she decided to throw some really tough, difficult dives that she doesn't normally compete, and she's going to do that again today in round 6. Here, though, in round 1, she starts off similar to other folks in this competition with an inward 1.5 pike. To me, the difference here is she gets a lot more height off of the diving board than what we just saw from Marcela from the University of Miami. Terrific entry into the water as well. I disagree heavily with judge number 1 giving her a 5. I want to ask him if his finger slipped on the score keypad, because I couldn't disagree more. That was a 7.5 dive.
It's the judge from France.
Is it?
Right? And it was corrected, so the finger must have slipped.
Technology.
3 7.5s for Bromberg. Gives her an even 54. Brings up Meaghan O'Brien. reigning Big 12 champ, on the 1 meter board.
When you watch Meaghan, look at how much height she gets from that diving board, and it's all strength. She's able to be patient on the board and get every ounce of it she can. She's at least 2 feet higher than every single diver in this competition. Absolutely beautiful.
Reflected in the scores, 2 7.5s and an 8 for O'Brien, 55.20. See head coach Matt Scoggin in his 23rd season. He's coached 19 UT divers to NCAA titles. I believe that would be 20 now after that title from Alison Gibson, who you now see, the first UT athlete on the women's side since 2007 to claim an NCAA title.
And as a freshman. And now she's back her sophomore year and still looking better than ever. Another inward 1.5. It's feeling a little repetitive at this point, but she manages to step things up a bit with her positions in the air. She's so graceful, perfect distance. It's those fine little details that are going to make or break somebody in this 1 meter event.
Talked with Coach Scoggin after yesterday, and he had used Meaghan O'Brien and her consistency, saying that's what he wanted to see from Bromberg and Gibson. Some of the men looking on, they will be in competition later on the 3 meter. Yesterday's champion in the 1 meter on the wind side, Jordan Windle, was in the middle there. Back to the top of the order. Morgan Mello from BYU, inward 2 somersault tuck.
Now what's interesting here, and we'll see this from both divers from BYU, they're going to be doing feet first entries, which isn't very common, but you do see it now and then in the 1 meter event. That one of the reasons you don't see it often is because it is incredibly difficult to hit the water feet first out of a dive like that and have a clean entry. And we all know that entry is incredibly important. Not only is it something that the judges are basing things off of, but it's the last thing they see and it's the last impression that they get.
You had pulled those dives out when we saw the dive order and dive sheet for these divers and said these will be difficult ones for that reason right there.
In most cases, you're going to see all of these divers want to be executing 6 dives that are head first. However, if you don't have that 6th dive or you don't feel as comfortable with one of them, then a lot of times they end up putting a feet first dive in.
4.5 and 2 5s for the sophomore Morgan Mello. Teammate Elizabeth Holmes. 303C, DD of 2.1.
Excellent dive. Unfortunately, some of the other athletes are going to be doing this in the pike position and have a higher degree of difficulty to multiply their scores by, but she should be very proud of this dive. Great positions in the air. She's very graceful in her movements, which is important. However, she needs a little bit more height and a little bit more dynamics in order to see some of those bigger scores.
6.5, 2 7s, 43.05. And as you mentioned, so now we go from the 303C to the 303B, the dive that will be competed by both Chaney and Wally Leyland from Miami, both sitting atop the leaderboard after round 1.
Excellent dive. Unfortunately, a little bit of a splash there when she hit the water. Otherwise, gorgeous. Perfect distance from the diving board and looked terrific in the air. Right here, you can see it's exactly where you want to be from the board. She bends her knees when she hits the water in order to try and hide a little bit of her over rotation, and it creates a splash when she does so.
2 7s and a 6, even 48 for Chaney. Was in second place after round 1. Love that sound we get between the competitors and the coaches.
Me too. And Randy Abelman there telling her that her hurdle was great. She looked beautiful in the air. She needs to be more confident when she kicks out of it in order to not over-rotate.
Your leader after one round, Wally Leyland, in with the same dive.
And she just stepped it up. I can't pick out many things wrong with this, so I'm just going to talk about all the things I love about it. She gets some excellent height off of the board because her hurdle is spot on, perfectly balanced, great position in the air. When you're in that pike, you want those straight knees and pointed toes and a classic Wally Leyland entrance.
Well, and you see the difference in the scores from the previous dive, a 7.5, an 8, and an 8.5 for Wally Leyland. Keeps her in first place through her 2 dives. Marcela Maric, 105B, which is a forward 2.5 somersault pike, DD of 2.6.
Wow, these Miami Hurricanes are not making it easy on Texas. Front 2.5 pike, and that was the most beautiful pike position we've seen so far tonight. You can't see anything through that pike. It is just such a tight, clean position, perfectly vertical, and an excellent second round dive for Marcela.
We're going to have to get them an entry chain. Football team has the turnover chain, but
yes, I couldn't agree more.
You know, you come out, you have,
chain. If you get a good rip,
exactly.
You get a chain.
Boom, get out there and you get to rock it until your next dive.
I think Wally Leyland would live in it if it were a rip chain. So I couldn't agree more. We have to move that beyond football for sure.
Big dive coming up for Murphy Bromberg, that 105B we just saw from Maric. So you had mentioned this before, what this does to the judges when they've seen it executed very well. That's the barometer here for Bromberg.
And she lives up to it. I love how much she didn't hold back. And we're going to get to see these now side by side. She doesn't hold back at all. She really goes after this rotation and manages to control it and come out at the perfect time in order to reach for the water. What stands out to me is Murphy's height and just how much faster she looks in her rotation, which is tough to see in slow motion. Both excellent dives, but I thought Murphy stood out a little bit more.
Great entry for Bromberg as well. You saw just very minimal splash. So Bromberg into the mix now in second place, trailing Wayland, with some big dives to come from her fellow Texas Longhorns teammates. Starts with Meaghan O'Brien, NCAA qualifier the last 2 years in both the 1 meter and the 3 meter. On the one, she finished 26th. It's the back 1.5 somersault pike.
It is. It's her easiest dive in this particular event. And she nails it. A little bit over rotated, but she bends her knees as she hits the water in order to try and minimize that splash. You had mentioned she was an NCAA qualifier, and she's qualified the last 2 years, but has been very frustrated with her performances at that level. And she's really taken that with her into this season and into her training, according to her coach, Matt Scoggin.
2 7s and a 7.5. She's the reigning Big 12 champion on the 1 meter board. Finished third at NCAA Zone D, and so that's some of what you're talking about, then that carryover to close it strong. That's exactly what Alison Gibson did. She is up on the exact same dive, but ending her NCAA season last year with the championship, and we got to hear from her, show you that a little bit later about what that felt like.
Excellent dive. I think she has perfect distance from the diving board, whereas other divers has a tendency to lean back a little bit. But then when she hits the water, there's barely a splash. What an entry. I love that angle because you get to see how important it is to grab your hand, and you need to squeeze your shoulders up as tight as you can in order to create no splash.
And you see the consistency in the scores, 8s all across. That's what was lacking for Gibson yesterday. So busy summer as she looks to build on that phenomenal freshman campaign. So we're in round number 3 now, top of the order, starting with Morgan Mello, 203B to kick things off.
She doesn't have enough speed coming off of the diving board. So she ends up coming out of that pike position earlier than she should, but she's got to reach for the water at some point, and she just does not have enough speed to make it all the way around.
3 6s for Morgan Mello on that dive. Mentioned the current standings. Wally Leyland atop the leaderboard, followed by Murphy Bromberg, this prior to the dive from Morgan Mello. Marcela Maric, Alison Gibson, Carolyn Chaney, Meaghan O'Brien, followed by Elizabeth Holmes, who will be competing her third dive, 52.25D. This is another one of those that you enter feet first.
It is. She'll be doing a back somersault with 2.5 twists, which has a high degree of difficulty because it's a lot of twisting, but it's very tough to come out square and enter the water cleanly. That's pretty good. Considering what I've seen other divers do for this dive, it's very hard to stop that twist on a dime and hit the water square. She still over-rotates a little bit. You see there when she hits the water. Also has a pretty good splash because when you're going in feet first, it's tough not to. But that was one of the better back 2.5 twists I've seen on 1 meter.
Her highest score of the 3 dives competed thus far with the 47.25. Carolyn Chaney is in 5th place coming into this round. Reverse 1.5 somersault, 1.5 free twist.
Now this is where it's going to get interesting, and I'm very impressed with what Carolyn was about to do on that hurdle there. She was a little bit back from the end of the diving board. You could hear the diving board, which you never want to. It means she doesn't have the right rhythm. However, it didn't phase her. She kept her composure and still managed to execute a terrific dive.
6.5, 7.7 for 53.30 for Chaney. She competed at the USA Diving National Championships, in which she finished 17th, was 3rd in the ACC last year. Goes by CC, is a biology major on a pre-med track. We talked about that yesterday. Good place to be at the University of Miami. Wally Leyland, current overall leader.
And that was a gorgeous dive, but it needed to be because the degree of difficulty is only a 2.2. It's her easiest dive out of all 6 rounds. She gets 8s from every judge because it is hard to find something wrong with this dive. Again, beautiful entry like usual, but this is where things are going to get a little tough because you have only 14 points dividing the top 6 divers after the first 2 rounds. So if you're going to be competing a degree of difficulty dive that's just a 2.2, you're going to need to compete it perfectly.
And that's what you had mentioned with Leyland able to develop some of that space. Her first 2 dives, 2.6, 2.4. When you look at O'Brien and Gibson, a 2.4 and a 2.3, their dives coming up in this round, those are the 2.6s. So chance to get those bigger scores.
Yes, Leyland needed that 14-point lead on the rest of the competition because they could chip away at it a little bit in this round.
March currently in 3rd after 2 rounds.
Competing the same dive we just saw from her teammate Leyland, and in a very similar fashion. She didn't have quite the clean entry into the water that we saw from Wally, but otherwise it's almost identical in how beautiful it is and how great that twisting position looks.
7.5 even across the board for March. Gives her 49.50, total score of 159.60 through 3 dives. Murphy Bromberg coming up next to 203B. This is her easiest dive at 2.3 DD.
It's her easiest dive. This is one of those dives, I think she gets up and it is just, closes her eyes. She could knows this dive like the back of her hand.
Easiest only in the degree of difficulty.
Yes. Oh, I spoke too soon. Did I jinx her? I might have just jinxed her. That is very uncommon for Murphy. She's an incredibly consistent diver. Maybe a little bit of adrenaline, I'm not sure. It looked terrific on the takeoff. and she rotates so quickly. She needed to come out of that pike position and reach for the water much sooner. I'll blame myself. I definitely jinxed it.
You're going to take that one?
I'll take that one.
So the lowest score of the day from Bromberg. Sure, she is disappointed in such. We'll bring up Meaghan O'Brien, and this is the dives get harder, potential to score higher, DD of 2.6.
That's an excellent dive. She just needs to clean up the entry a bit. It looks great in the air, like we've talked about. She's just so strong and gets so much height out of that diving board. Good position too, but hits the water and a little bit of a splash. You see her feet separate there in slow motion. So a few things there that the judges might pick on.
Saw Murphy Bromberg compete that earlier for a 58.5. O'Brien in with that 54.60.
She got a 6 from one judge and 2 7.5s. Bit of a discrepancy there, which is unique, but one judge saw something that maybe he didn't like.
Alison Gibson to close out round number 3. Same dive as her teammate we just saw.
Oh, she really saved herself because that hurdle wasn't setting her up for a whole lot of success. She seemed a bit out of balance throughout the entire hurdle. She's up in the corner a little bit. Toes are curled over the edge of the board. However, she manages to know that dive well enough that from a timing standpoint, she reached for the water at the right time and came out of that pike, so she was able to save a dive for some pretty good scores.
7.5, 7.5, and an 8 for a 59.80, so she best the score that Bromberg had posted earlier on that same dive. Leyland still atop, followed by Gibson, Chaney, Maric, O'Brien, and Bromberg.
What we're going to see here is a battle of degree of difficulty because you have Alison Gibson putting together some of her hardest dives at the end of her list, whereas Wally Leyland has one dive mixed in there that's a little bit easier at just a 2.3 degree difficulty, so she's going to have to do it perfectly if she's going to keep her lead. Gibson
with 2 dives remaining, DD of 2.6. O'Brien a 2.6 and a 2.5 to close it out. As for Leyland, 2.6, 2.3, and 2.4. There's the 4th dive from Morgan Mello.
And it's a reverse 1.5 in the tuck position. Degree of difficulty is only a 2.1. The other divers you see are doing this in the pike position, but she does manage to land on her head. She's vertical, and the judges give it a 6.5 because it's a solid average dive.
40.95 total score on that dive for Morgan Mello. Now stands at a 166.15. It's Tice Routson, the head coach for BYU. In his 3rd season, 4-time NCAA champion, 11-time All-American at Miami, so some great history between Routson and Randy Abelman. Elizabeth Holmes, 105C.
She doesn't perfectly straighten her body when she hits the water, which we'll see it'll be a little bit more obvious on the replay in slow motion. It looked great off the diving board and she has a nice position in the air, but when she reaches for the water, she's just still a little bit curved. And if she can give herself enough time to straighten her body all the way out, she'll get another point or 2 in there.
45.60 brings her to a 180.75. So now we get into the back and forth between the Hurricanes and the Longhorns. Carolyn Chaney in 3rd place. But now she gets to the lower DDs of her 6 dives. This, the lowest at 2.3 on the 203B.
Unfortunately, she lets it just wash over a bit too much rather than come out of that pike at the right time and be confident in reaching for the water so she can land vertical. She's a beautiful diver to watch. I really enjoy seeing her position. She's very dynamic, but also still very pretty to watch, which can be a tough thing to kind of combine both of those aspects of your diving. Unfortunately, she just lets it over-rotate.
And that's the lowest score posted thus far for Chaney. Overall leader, Wally Leyland, is tied for the highest degree of difficulty amongst her 6 dives. We'll see her and both Maric compete this dive back to back.
She does a great job with it. She looks like she's straining just a little bit at the very end in order to get to the water and get vertical, but she has a lovely twisting position in the air. Her legs are perfectly straight and together. Her body is very straight, which can be tough to do when you're twisting and flipping all at the same time. 2 7s and a 7.5 from the judges, and it might be enough to keep her in the lead.
0.90 for Leyland, and I'm starting to see exactly what you're saying about that entry. Her entry always looks so smooth.
So smooth. She really would have to, something drastic would have to happen for her to not rip when she hits the water. It's just phenomenal to watch.
So same dive for the junior Maric.
Same dive, but when she hits the water, she isn't able to control it enough, so she ends up continuing to twist. And that's one of the toughest things to do in these dives, when you come out of that twisting position to stay square. And instead, right here, you see both of her legs. And she's going to see some big deductions for that. 5.5, 5.5, 6 from each of the judges.
44.20 for Maric. In 4th place entering this round. Now a chance to make up some ground for the Texas trio we talked about at the top of the show. It starts with Murphy Bromberg. 303B. DD of 2.4 as Coach Scoggin looks on.
Here's what I like about this. She bounced back well from a rough 3rd round, which isn't easy to do. So she was a bit frustrated with her back 1.5 pike, but she still manages to come out and execute a reverse 1.5 pike much better.
But what did you not like?
I thought she hit the water a little bit shy of vertical and was splashy.
I
you
could
knew
tell.
I'd have something.
I heard it in the tone in your voice. Even 7s across the board for Bromberg. Brings her to 199.85, so
Why can't you just let me be positive? Come on.
Well, I just heard it in your, said, here's what I like. But, so O'Brien, a 303B, in this, one of her best dives.
It is. It's one of her best dives. The same thing we just saw from her teammate Bromberg as well. And that's why it's one of her best dives. Her height off of the diving board is unlike anyone else's, and you'll see why. When she does her hurdle, she actually is strong enough to dip the diving board into the water. So watch here very closely, and you'll actually see it splash the water. I don't know of another female in the country who can do that. And then she still manages to control the dive beautifully.
8.5 for O'Brien, a even 60, so that's going to bring her right into the mix. Beautiful dive from the reigning Big 12 champion. Closing out round number 4, the reigning NCAA champion, Alison Gibson. Same dive.
Oh, that was going to be a struggle from the beginning on that hurdle. You'll see her toes curled over the end of the diving board, which is very difficult to then come back from and control. She struggled with her hurdles throughout the competition, today and yesterday. If she can get that under control and get a little bit more confidence on that, she would have been fine.
6.5, and a 6.5 for a 45.60 puts her at 213.4. That is 3rd place, and that's...
Oh, she could really get close to Wally Leyland in the next 2 rounds because, to your mention, she has much more difficult dives coming up. Wally competed a lot of her tougher dives in the beginning, whereas Meaghan managed to do them earlier.
Morgan Mello will start off round number 5. Leyland has led from the get-go all 4 rounds, but it was that big shakeup you mentioned, 5th to 2nd. As Mello is in.
The front 1.5 with a full twist we've seen from a few of these athletes, and this is one of the best ones we've seen. She manages to be very square when she hits the water, which we saw some divers struggle with in the previous round. You'll see when she hits perfectly straight, some pretty good scores from the judges, 6, 6.5, and 1.7.
42.90, first 7. The competition for the sophomore Morgan Mello. Was 2nd at last year's Mountain Pacific Federation Diving Championships. That's the conference that BYU competes in. Elizabeth Holmes.
She'll be competing in inward 1.5 pike, which we saw from a lot of the divers earlier in the competition because it tends to be a dive that people are very comfortable with. And a lot of times you like to start your first round with something you feel very confident in. Not her best dive of the competition so far. When she hits the water, her legs actually create a bit of a splash. So it looks like she's going in pretty vertical, but her legs create that splash right there. And the judges are going to deduct for that.
.20. It's actually her highest score she's posted thus far in the competition. Carolyn Chaney dropped from 3rd to 5th. Inward 1.5 somersault pike. Same dive we just saw from Holmes.
She's looking to redeem herself with that dive, and we saw Coach Randy Abelman looking on. He's going to be very happy with this. A little bit of a splash coming off of her legs when she hit the water, but it looks great in the air and a perfect distance from the diving board right there. Judges give it a 7, 7, 7.5, and that's a good way to kind of get herself back into a rhythm after she struggled in round 4.
51.60 brings her to 253.95 through 5 dives. Wire-to-wire leader thus far, Wally Leyland. But this her 2nd easiest in terms of DD dive at 2.3 on the back 1.5 somersault pike.
That being said, we've seen her capable of nailing these easy dives for 8s. And she does it again. It is all about the entry with Wally Leyland. That, and if you watch her in the air, it's just enjoyable. She has just beautiful lines. She looks very elegant throughout her dives. And then it doesn't hurt that when she hits the water, she doesn't believe in splashes.
She has finished 3rd at the UT Diving Invitational going back to 2015. That will garner a 7, an 8, and an 8.5 for 54.05. What you said. She doesn't believe.
We don't believe in splashes with Wally Leyland.
That's a good thing if you're a diver, right?
It is. It's really impressive what she's able to do.
Marcela Maric. She was in 11th at the 2015 UT Diving Invitational, so did not advance out of the prelims into the finals. So has to like what she's done thus far. Currently in 4th.
She did a great job there. Now what she did is called a knee save when she hits the water. You see a little bit of a splash come up from it, but she actually saved the dive a bit from what it could have been. This is a great underwater shot. You can see right as she's hitting the water, she bends her knees in order to bring some of that water under with her because she felt like she might be over-rotating, and it also kind of hides a little bit of that over-rotation.
Great shot from under the water, and perfect opportunity to shout out all of our crew working across these 2 days and the setup required to bring you all these great shots. So a round of applause for you folks to bring you those looks. Murphy Bromberg up on 53.33D.
Now, one of her teammates did mention that that dive right there is one of her critical dives. She can struggle with it, And she executed that one pretty well. Not her best. She did leave it a little bit short of vertical, and she was in a little bit of a pike when she hit the water. You can see right there, she just isn't quite able to make it all the way around. That's a great angle, though, to see how beautiful her twist is. If she can just get a little bit more speed behind that rotation, that dive could be perfect.
3 7s for Bromberg. Oh, 2 6.5s and a 7, so there was a score change. That's what, if you could hear the public address announcer. That now brings up Meaghan O'Brien. This originally slated to be a 53-33D. That had a DD of 2.6. That has changed. So O'Brien now maybe going for that win.
She's upping the ante. A reverse 1.5 with 2.5 twists. To give you a little perspective, I competed this dive on 3 meter when I was a diver. She's able to do it with literally 2 less meters than I had.
When you talked about the power.
Oh, and it's great. A little bit short of vertical, but it doesn't matter. You hear the cheers from these divers because that's just so impressive. And I just can't stress enough just how powerful she is. Dips that diving board into the water. And Coach Scoggin told us a funny story earlier about her being the only woman we think who's ever been able to actually crack a diving board because she's so strong and so powerful.
Well, and this is where we had talked about the dives getting more difficult for O'Brien and what she would be able to do to catch up with Wally Leyland. The score's a 6.5, 7, 7. And we do have a picture of the diving board she has cracked. You see it right there. It's sitting outside here of Lee and Joe Jamail Swimming Center.
Her brother, previously Sean O'Brien, dove for Texas. He cracked 2 diving boards because he was so strong. Meaghan's got
family.
1 under her belt. The O'Brien family owes the University of Texas quite a few diving boards at this point.
Well, I'm sure with dives like that, Coach Scoggin and the rest of the crew will take it.
He's happy to replace that board whenever he needs to.
Alison Gibson,
Oh,
51-34.
Gorgeous dive. A front 1.5 with 2 twists, and by far the best one we've seen in this competition. Not a splash on that entry, and absolutely perfect in the air. You could see she was actually off to the side on that hurdle as well.
Love those overhead looks. But reflected in the scores you had talked about at 8.5, 8.5, a 9, the best dive of the day and score we have seen thus far. So big for Alison Gibson, and that really makes things interesting as we now have a new leader in O'Brien, but look at how tight it is between those top 3 divers.
I love this. This is going to be such a fun final round to watch. We have different degrees of difficulty going on. We'll see who's able to pull it off, but it's really anyone's game at this point.
Well, and much as we saw yesterday, Kat, it was O'Brien, the story, consistency. And for Gibson, it was a little bit of up, down, up, down. We've seen that really here in day number 2, but it's going to come down to this final dive.
It has. So we've seen a lot of consistency from Wally Leyland today, a lot of consistency from Meaghan O'Brien. Alison Gibson has had her peaks and valleys, but her final dive will show a little bit of her character in competition. She's never competed it before. She only learned it about 2 weeks ago. So it's going to be interesting regardless at the end here.
So closing out her 1 meter competition is Morgan Mello with that 105C.
Good execution on that. Doesn't come out all the way into a straight body position when she hits the water, but still manages to get 6.5, 6.5, 5.5 from the judges.
So she will end the competition at 253.45. But if you go back to those standings, it's just 1 1/4 point that separates Gibson from O'Brien, with Leyland there in between the two. So this is going to be a good trio of dives. Leyland will dive first, 4th in the order here in the final round. Elizabeth Holmes, 404C.
Another feet first entry, and this one always, I'll be honest, kind of scares me to watch a little bit. She does it very well. It has nothing to do with her specifically. It's just a dive that you're in an inward position, you are rotating towards the diving board. So if she were to over-rotate there, it could put her in a little bit of a dangerous spot. She manages to do very well, kicks out at the right time, and still gets some pretty good scores.
In terms of the feet first dives we have seen, that looked maybe to be the best?
It was one of the better ones. She actually also had that back 2.5 twister that was very good too. So for as far as feet first entries go, her
back 1.5 somersault, 1.5 twist free, DD of 2.5 for the junior from University of Miami.
That's going to put a lot of pressure on her teammate Marcela. They are very close, less than a point away from each other. And I think there's a lot of internal competition usually with any team, and that's a heck of a way to end her list of 6 dives. 7.5, 7, 7.5. Beautiful entry into the water, and she just looks very graceful as she's diving.
You said your competition days, you weren't a scoreboard watcher, but now up here in the booth, we've got you.
Now I am.
Now you're checking out the standings.
It's a lot more fun in the seat when I'm not the one actually out there.
308.95 is the total mark posted by Chaney. And now it brings up Wally Leyland. This is her final. O'Brien and Gibson, their dive's harder than Leyland's. This is 2.4, but as we have seen, she can really nail her diving.
Not surprising, the entry is phenomenal, but she does leave it a little bit short, and she's going to be pretty frustrated with that because that could have been 9s. Right here when she hits the water, she's just not quite at vertical. She easily could have been. She just kind of came out and reached for the water a bit too early. Still beautiful, but not quite as perfect as she needed.
So that the difference as 3 7s from the judges. You see the final tally for Leyland at 331.85. Marcela Maric close out her competition with a 203B.
And she over-rotates this one a little. She seems pretty frustrated. What you see is your visual cues in your dive. So she's probably looking for the water or the diving board, whatever her visual cue is, in order to know to come out of that pike position. And instead, she comes out a bit too late and can't control the entry.
She needed 8s to catch up with her teammate Chaney, as you mentioned, but 6s across the board, 295.60 for Maric. And this will be a good one to watch for Murphy Bromberg. She added this in at the end of 405C, DD of 3.1. She has never competed this dive.
Now, I know she's not in the running for the lead anymore, but this is the particular dive that I've been most excited to watch throughout this entire event. Not many women compete this dive. Oh, I love it. That was incredible. That was unbelievable. Had she not stumbled a little bit earlier, that probably would have put her in first place. Degree of difficulty, a 3.1. She is so confident standing over that diving board, really gets after it. Beautiful way to end her 1 meter event.
7, 7, and a 7.5 for Bromberg. So ending on a high note at 316.50, but still behind Leyland. So now Meaghan O'Brien. She needs to score 7s to get ahead of Wally Leyland. Already has 1 title, the 3 meter champion yesterday.
Her consistency pays off. That was a terrific final dive for what was a very solid list. At this point in the season, you're not going to see a lot of athletes throughout the country able to do what she just did. And she closes it out with not her most difficult dive, but extremely accurate and best entry of the night so far.
She got a 7, a 7.5, and a 7.5, so that will put her in first place. She was in 5th after the first 2 rounds, jumped to 2nd in round number 4. Now sits atop the leaderboard. 1 dive left, coming from Alison Gibson.
You're on trampoline with me in the morning.
So 50 halves or above to overtake O'Brien.
A reverse 1.5 with 1.5 twists, and she learned this dive just 2 weeks ago, so I'm very impressed. She didn't have a good hurdle on the end of the board. You'll see her toes are several inches back from the board, and to still get up and confidently get after that twist, she still puts together quite a good dive. She's just going to be happy she's finally got her first time competing that under her belt, and she'll feel that much more confident in her next meet.
So will it be good enough to overtake O'Brien? The score is 6.5, 7, 7, and it is not. She does jump over Leyland, so Texas goes 1-2, the champion, Meaghan O'Brien.
What an incredible final round. I love